Welcome back to History of the Ancient Near East. I'm Justin Singleton. Now, just like last time, we've reached a point in the recording of these lectures where I kind of have to speed things along, so there'll be less editing. Forgive me, I apologize. Hopefully you'll enjoy the lecture nonetheless. Okay, in this lecture, we're going to be discussing the southern Levant in the Middle to Late Bronze Ages. Basically, the land right before and then during the entrance of Israel. In our discussion, we're going to talk about the major differences in the Middle Bronze Age between MB2A and MB2B through C. In the Late Bronze Age, we'll discuss settlements and population, and we'll discuss the enigmatic Habiru, a term which may or may not include the ancient Hebrews. The Middle Bronze Age in the Levant is a transition from drought and famine in EB4 to security. Those affected by these environmental changes adapted to and overcame the circumstances of the drying phase that impacted much of the Northern Hemisphere, learning from the failures of the past in order to create a better future. As noted in a previous lecture, EB4 in the southern Levant was a period of disquietude. The large walled cities of EB3 were no longer in use. In their place, many small unwalled villages appeared, just like in EB1. The region was sparsely populated, and with the exception of a few walled cities, most fortified polities were found only in the north. As a matter of fact, the majority of EB4 settlements are established at locations different than EB3 settlements. Now, rather than urban centers, the southern Levantine populace in EB4 mainly consisted of mobile pastoralists and village dwellers, living in either small undefended villages or transitory encampments, and primarily acting as herders who sold their products to the benefit of the wool industry of the north, all things we've covered in previous lectures. These pastoralists included semi-mobile herders and nomadic pastoralists, the latter of which would include the biblical patriarch Abraham. Now, moving on to the Middle Bronze Age, we need to note that after many years of debate, Middle Bronze terminology is still confusing. William Foxwell Albright, sometimes referred to as the Dean of Biblical Archaeology, referred to Middle Bronze I as the period between the 22nd and 19th centuries BC, and Middle Bronze II following. As has already been noted, that period of time has now been linked with the Early Bronze Age and represents EB4. Now, to avoid confusion, many simply continue with Albright's terminology. They just skip over MB1 and beginning the Middle Bronze Age with MB2, specifically MB2A. Others, such as Kathleen Kenyon, William Deaver, and so forth, have attempted to correct the issue by referring to either the Intermediate Bronze Age, or EB4, and then immediately beginning the Middle Bronze with MB1. Now, of course, this issue is not going to be resolved anytime soon, so as you read about the period, pay attention and note that when we're talking about the Middle Bronze Age, or even the very end of the Early Bronze Age, you're really going to have to try to interpret what the scholar means. Now, beyond the confusion of the Early Bronze IV period, differing scholars include differing divisions to the Middle Bronze Age, stemming from the following division. Middle Bronze IIA, or MB1, and you can see the dates there. MB2B, sometimes referred to as MB2, and of course MB2C, sometimes referred to as MB3. Now, you'll have to forgive me, I see in the material says MB1 on that third section, but really it should be MB3 III, Roman numerals. Forgive me for that. For some, Middle Bronze 2, B through C, is a combined phase, but others see a sharp break between the two periods. Now, as the original sub-phases of 2B and 2C were established in an attempt to refine the ceramic typology of two sites, and as it's quite difficult to differentiate ceramically between two periods only 100 years apart, I'm just going to follow with Amahai Mazar and refer to EB4, followed by MB2A, followed by MB2B through C. I know that's a lot of complicated material, but hopefully it makes sense. The first period of the Middle Bronze Age, then, is known as MB2A and extends from around 2000 to 1750 BC. Now here, a stark contrast between EB4 and MB2A can be seen in settlement patterns. In particular, the shift toward monumental architecture. Of course, every period contains a transition, and this can be seen in the earliest phases of MB2A, as fortifications are practically unattested. Interestingly, in the Egyptian story of Senui, a temporary exile to Canaan, written during this period, semi-nomadic pastoralists are said to have opened the encampment to the Egyptian, feeding and sheltering him for a time. Now, of note, although Senui mentions several cities in the northern Levant, the region in which he's staying is made up of transitory camps, and likely represents the very beginning of the Middle Bronze Age, just right after EB4. During the latter part of MB2A in the southern Levant, there was an almost complete change in material culture from EB4. This period witnessed a regeneration of urban societies, initially along the coastal regions and routes of both transportation and communication. And the region of the Levant developed into a unified Canaanite culture as a result of the rise of that urbanization that intertwined the north with the south. Fortifications at the time include such defensive installations as earthen ramparts, mud brick walls on stone foundations, rectangular towers, and glacis. These are the artificial hills, basically. It makes it harder to run up or to keep siege weapons from coming in. And many of many sites of which appear on virgin soil. These cities sometimes contain multi-entry gates, and the urban planning was different than that of EB3. The rather rapid onset of this second urbanization was likely strongly influenced by the northern Levant, or diffused southward, as it's called, particularly as fortified cities sprang up in the northern parts of the southern Levant, and contained many similarities to northern Levantine sites, like Ebla. Now, ceramics, too, were quite different than the previous EB4 period. As first determined at major urban centers such as Afik, this newly formed combined Canaanite culture allowed for the interchange of ideas to spread across the region, including that of the potter's fast wheel, resulting in new varieties and shapes that appear unrelated to the ceramics of the deflated EB4 period, but recall types from the first urbanization period under EB3, as noted in the last lecture. Now, in the earliest phases of MB2A, pottery assemblages are quite similar to the inland regions in the northern Levant. But by the middle phase of the period, red slipped and burnished pottery is common, and decorations of red or black paint are quite similar to the ceramic assemblage at Byblos. Of particular interest to a later chapter in this study are a group of pottery from Egypt referred to as ostraca. These are inscriptions on pottery fragments dating to the Middle Bronze Age called execration texts. Now, execration texts cite places or peoples to be cursed who were hostile to Egypt. These are all found in Egypt. And these can be found from the Old Kingdom through the New Kingdom. Now, of note, later execration texts, contain many more place names in Canaan than the earliest execration text, possibly suggesting a continued expansion in the southern Levant. Now, interestingly, earlier texts include theophoric place names in the southern Levant, place names using the names of deities, in this case using El or Ilu elements, establishing the Semitic El as a deity of note in the region. Later execration texts reveal a shift, as theophoric place names now include Hadad rather than El, Hadad being another name for Baal. A third major innovation during the Middle Bronze 2A concerns the use of metals, specifically the large-scale introduction of bronze alloy, also noted in the last lecture. After 2 millennia of copper and arsenic copper use in the Levant, complex metal alloying is introduced. New metallurgical practices brought new tools and weapons, including the duckbill axe, discovered in the southern and northern Levant and as far away as the Mari region, suggesting interchange between the Levant and northern Mesopotamia. Other new weapons and tools include the before-mentioned chisel-shaped axe, shafted spearheads, a new dagger design, and, of course, the sickle sword. Interestingly, most Middle Bronze Age sites in the southern Levant contain a great quantity of either MB2A or MB2B through C materials, establishing a somewhat clear break between the two periods. Now, of note, the transition was rather smooth and peaceful, and the growth of the MB2B through C likely had much to do with a dwindling Egypt, whose 13th dynasty was a period of weakness. The instability of Egypt at this time allowed for independent growth on the part of the Levantine city-states. Thus, from MB2B is introduced a trend of settlement expansion, as seen at Shechem, Hebron, Jerusalem, and many more places, including great fortification systems, suggesting an organized central authority within those cities, and even a rivalry between them. This expansion may be explained by the wetter seasons during MB2B through C as compared to the earlier dates. Obviously, water increasing food and other resource yields. This continuation of MB2A developments led toward a centralization of economic, political, and social systems, as well as a standardization of material culture. Fortifications during this time were unparalleled in sophistication, specifically including massive glacis and earthen ramparts designed to negate siege devices and techniques by creating steep artificial slopes below the city walls. Of note, as the Middle Bronze Age continued, rural settlements are abandoned in favor of the safety and security of walled cities. And these walled cities develop well-planned public buildings, suggesting a palace economy. But note that Tel El Hayat remained an unwalled village during MB2B through C, despite the presence of a classic Canaanite temple of a smaller scale to those at neighboring urban sites. Now, pottery at this stage moves away from the regionalistic differences and red burnished ware of MB2A, and although basic forms continue from the previous period, significant changes are made. As much time had passed since the introduction to the fast wheel, the use of the fast wheel was perfected, creating particularly good quality ceramics, including the now wheel-made cooking pots. The red burnished surface treatments were now replaced with a white or creamy slip, A slip is basically a watered down clay that you kind of paint on. And painted decorations are rare. Middle Bronze 2 B through C also saw an increase in prestige grave goods, though the so-called warrior burials dating to MB2A declined in occurrence by MB2B. Now, whereas the Middle Bronze Age in the southern Levant is a period of prosperity, the Late Bronze Age in the region experienced both a high point, technologically, mercantilely, and artistically, and a period of decline in terms of the number of sizes and settlements, including the abandonment or destruction of fortifications, and the quality of some material culture. The period is duly characterized by the domination of the Egyptian Empire and economic and cultural involvement in world affairs, thus marking the Late Bronze Age as a pivotal moment in the history, culture, and society of the region. Now, the political entities that existed in the southern Levant during the Middle Bronze Age were basically the same political entities that existed in the Late Bronze Age, except now the region consists of differing vassal kingdoms who were subject to foreign rule, the south being controlled by Egypt. Interestingly, many of the destructions found at the dawn of the Late Bronze Age may have been partly due to Egyptian pursuit of the Hyksos, having chased the Hyksos into the Levant and recaptured the region at the same time. Now, in fact, the subdivisions of the Late Bronze Age are intricately tied to the new Kingdom of Egypt. Additionally, at this time, the entirety of the Near East, also Anatolia, the Iranian Plateau, the Aegean, Nubia, and well beyond, all became intertwined in an international system that would continue until today. The Late Bronze Age is divided into either 3 or 4 subdivisions, depending on the scholar. These are either a split between Late Bronze 1 through 3, or Late Bronze 1 A through B, and Late Bronze 2 A through B, as per Mazar. As a whole, the period reveals the Levant as a hub of communication and exchange, the region being squeezed between Anatolia and Egypt, but also Central Mediterranean and Mesopotamian contact and influences, including, as I said, the Aegean, Cyprus, Syria, and far, far beyond, altogether demonstrating intensive mercantile interactions. Now, it's important to note that the population and density of sites declined during this period, the fringe areas becoming deserted, and some MB2 polities being abandoned, and some sites being replaced with Egyptian fortresses. Now, compared to Egypt, the remaining polities in the southern Levant during the Late Bronze Age were rather small, existing as clusters of semi-autonomous city-states, rather than having any imperialistic ambitions. Although the region was subject to Egypt, it was ruled locally by kings. In fact, an Ugaritic letter to the king of Egypt at the time refers to Canaan as the Egyptian king's land, the inhabitants as the sons of Canaan, and the local kings as servants of Egypt. As such, Canaanite society, culture, and economy oscillated between dependence and autonomy, between pleasing Egypt and administrating the city-state. Thus, the political and territorial organization of the southern Levant was quite diverse and somewhat less integrated than during the Middle Bronze Age. For the first time in the region, peaceful coexistence was possible, as settlements negotiated territorial apportionment between themselves, appealing to the king of Egypt when needed. Now, during the Amarna period of the southern Levant in Egypt, which is 14th century BC, letters sent to the Egyptian king refer to a people who were continually causing problems in the southern Levantine cities. Within the Amarna letters, these Habiru are seen as enemies who wish to destroy the Canaanite feudal system, and therefore must dislike Egypt. These enemies appear to have been non-sedentary and lived in the hill country of the southern Levant. It's been suggested that these Habiru are in some way related to the Hebrews of the Old Testament, particularly as the Semitic radicals or letters are the same. The whole HBR, Hebrew, Habiru, or PR, if you will, depending on how you pronounced Hapiru. And the location and the time period somewhat match that of the Hebrew conquest under Joshua. The oldest sources that discuss the Habiru come from Kanish, which, if you remember from an earlier lecture, is a city in Anatolia that contained an Assyrian exchange outpost dating to the 19th century BC. Here, it's difficult to ascertain the identity of those referred to with the term, and the time period places the Israelites in Egypt rather than Anatolia, establishing a clear difference between the Hebrews and the Hapiru. Still, there appear to have been similarities between the two groups. Firstly, the term Hebrew, Ivrit, may have had derogatory origins in the Old Testament, particularly as early on the term was used by Egyptians and Philistines in reference to the Israelites, such as the instance of Potiphar's wife referring to Joseph as a Hebrew, almost in a derogatory way. Or you're going to believe that Hebrew? In fact, according to some, it's only later that the term Hebrew loses its derogatory connotations. And even today, some Jewish commentators believe the term to have anti-Semitic overtones. Similarly, the term Habiru may be etymologically related to the Semitic root, which is, BR, HBR, meaning to trespass. In the Amarna letter 3:18, the name appears alongside the term robber. And in the Amarna letter 290, forgive me, I am trying to catch up here because I forgot to push the buttons. It would appear that one could become Habiru through warlike challenges to the then-present political powers. Thus, both the Hebrews and the Habiru of the time could be considered bad guys by the Egyptians and others. It would appear that the term Habiru is not an ethnic designation, but a name representing a social class of individuals. Now, some argue that the Habiru were a peasant class within Canaanite society that revolted against their overlords, a theory that some scholars argue includes the Hebrews, who they believe not to be a separate ethnic group as the Bible explains. Now, these people also say that the Exodus and conquest never occurred. On the contrary, what is common to all designated as Habiru is that they appear to have been peoples uprooted from their political frameworks and forced to adapt to new circumstances, having broken away from their formal social ties because of war, famine, disasters, and whatever else. The Habiru seem to be a people who may include the Hebrews. While it would be imprudent to argue that all Habiru are Hebrews, certainly at least some instances of the Habiru in the Amarna letters are referring to invading Hebrews, attempting to follow the pattern established by Joshua and drive out the inhabitants of the southern Levant. Now, this is an abnormally long lecture, and I apologize for that, but I hope you enjoyed it. As always, feel free to contact me if you need anything.